The mission was unlike any other in human history. It was spoken about in whispers long before the orders were signed, because everyone knew what it really meant. It wasn't a victory mission, and it wasn't even a survival mission. It was sacrifice. From the very beginning, the commanders who designed it admitted that whoever went would never come back. The chances of survival were so close to zero that no one even bothered to calculate them. And yet, someone had to go, because if no one did, Earth itself might not survive. When the news reached the selected crew, silence filled the briefing room. They were told straight, without any false hope. The enemy fleet was advancing, stronger and larger than anything humanity had ever faced. Entire worlds had already been burned by them, and Earth was next. Humanity had only one weapon powerful enough to stand against them. A single dreadnought. Massive, heavily armed, and bristling with firepower, it was the most advanced warship ever built by humans. But even with all its power, everyone knew the truth. One ship could not stand against an entire alien armada. Still, there was no choice. The dreadnought would be sent to delay the enemy, to hold them back just long enough for Earth to prepare its defenses. The mission would not save the crew, but it might save billions of innocent lives. That was the reality. Some of the younger officers looked shaken when the mission was explained. They had dreamed of glory, of heroism, of battles fought and won. But this was different. This was not about glory, it was about sacrifice. The older veterans understood right away. They had seen enough battles to know what the word delay really meant. Delay meant dying slowly so others could live. The captain, a calm and steady figure, stood before the crew and told them exactly what was at stake. His voice carried no lies, no promises of safe return. "We are not coming back," he said firmly. "But if we do our duty, if we fight with everything we have, then Earth has a chance to survive. Billions of lives depend on what we do. I will not order anyone to stay aboard. If you wish to leave, you may do so now." Not a single person moved. There was no applause, no cheering, no dramatic oath spoken aloud. Instead, there was a quiet and heavy silence, the kind of silence that meant every soul on that ship had made their choice. They would go. They would fight. And they would give everything. That night, many of them wrote letters. Letters to parents, to spouses, to children. Some wrote to friends they hadn't spoken to in years. Some wrote no letters at all, preferring to keep their last thoughts private. The letters would be stored safely on Earth, to be delivered only if the ship never returned. Deep down, everyone knew those letters would be delivered. The mood aboard the ship was strange. It was not sadness exactly, and it was not fear. It was something else, a mixture of determination and acceptance. The engineers walked the halls with tools in hand, checking every system twice, then 3 times. The gunners ran endless drills, practicing until their hands moved like machines. The medical staff stocked every supply they could find, knowing that in battle, their work would never be enough. Each crew member prepared in their own way. Some told jokes to hide the fear inside. Some grew quieter, spending long hours staring out at the stars, as if trying to memorize their beauty before it was lost to fire. But no one abandoned their post. The dreadnought itself loomed like a steel giant, docked in orbit above Earth. To the people watching from the ground, it was both a symbol of hope and of sorrow. Parents pointed it out to their children, saying, "They are going to protect us." The children asked, "When will they come home?" But the parents never answered. When the final day came, the crew stood at their stations, and the captain gave the order to launch. Engines roared to life, shaking the entire vessel. Slowly, the giant warship pulled away from orbit, leaving Earth behind. Millions watched as it disappeared into the blackness of space. For many, it felt like watching their own family vanish forever. Inside the ship, no one looked back. They had already said their goodbyes. Instead, they looked forward, toward the vast emptiness of space where the enemy fleet awaited. There was no false hope, no chance of rescue. They were on a one-way mission, and every single crew member knew it. And yet, in their hearts, there was no regret. They understood something that could never be written in orders or explained in numbers. They understood that sometimes, Survival is not about living. It is about ensuring others live on. They were willing to carry that burden, no matter the cost. The dreadnought was more than just steel and firepower now. It was the embodiment of human will. A ship filled with men and women who had already accepted death, yet still chose to fight. They knew they would never return, but they also knew that they would not fall easily. The impossible mission had begun. The day of departure arrived sooner than anyone expected. Time had moved strangely for the crew. Ever since the mission was announced, the hours had felt heavier, as though each second carried more weight than it should. Everyone aboard the dreadnought knew this would be their last time seeing Earth, and the thought sat silently in their hearts. Some of the crew stood by the viewing ports, staring down at the blue planet below. From space, Earth looked calm and peaceful, its white clouds drifting across oceans and green lands. To the crew, it was a painful beauty. They thought of the people they loved, their families, their friends, the lives they were leaving behind. Some whispered quiet promises that they would be remembered. Others simply stood in silence, holding their memories close. The captain walked the bridge with steady steps, greeting his officers with calm nods. He knew that beneath their focused expressions, they carried the same heavy thoughts. Every man and woman aboard had chosen to stay, but choosing did not make leaving easier. The captain himself had written a letter to his daughter the night before. He had told her he was proud, that he believed in her, and that she should live her life without regret. He sealed it knowing she would read it only after he was gone. Down in the hangar, mechanics worked furiously, giving the ship its final checks. They moved with precision, though their hands trembled slightly when no one was watching. A few of them laughed together as they tightened bolts and ran diagnostics, trying to mask their fear with humor. They all knew the ship was in perfect condition. It had been checked dozens of times already. But working kept their minds busy, and for a little while, it kept the fear away. In the medical bay, the doctors and nurses sorted through their supplies again. They knew there would never be enough bandages, enough medicine, enough tools for what was coming. Still, they organized every cabinet, every drawer, as if order could prepare them for the chaos of battle. One nurse quietly tucked a photograph of her parents into her pocket. Another doctor paused for a long time by the small window, watching the Earth spin slowly beneath them, before returning to his duties. In the medical bay, the doctors and nurses sorted through their supplies again. They knew there would never be enough bandages, enough medicine, enough tools for what was coming. Still, they organized every cabinet, every drawer, as if order could prepare them for the chaos of battle. One nurse quietly tucked a photograph of her parents into her pocket. Another doctor paused for a long time by the small window, watching the Earth spin slowly beneath them, before returning to his duties. Throughout the ship, people found their own ways to say goodbye. Some wrote final words in their journals. Some prayed quietly in corners. Some shared whispered conversations with friends, speaking about home, about favorite meals, about childhood memories, anything to remind themselves that they were human, and that those small moments were worth fighting for. The final call came from command. The ship was cleared to leave. All stations reported ready. There was a moment of stillness across the dreadnought, like the calm breath before a plunge into deep water. The captain sat in his chair, his hand hovering over the command console. He gave a single nod. Engines rumbled to life, and the massive warship shook with power. The lights across the ship glowed brighter as systems came online, and the quiet hum of the engines filled every hallway. Slowly, the dreadnought disengaged from the orbital dock. On the ground below, millions of people gathered to watch. From cities, fields, and mountain villages, they looked up at the night sky. To the naked eye, the dreadnought was only a streak of light moving across the darkness. But every person knew what it meant. They knew this ship carried their defenders, the ones who had chosen to face the enemy alone. Many saluted. Some cried. Parents held their children tightly and whispered stories they hoped the little ones would remember. In that moment, the entire planet felt united by both hope and sorrow. Inside the ship, the crew felt the weight of those watching eyes. They were leaving behind everything they had ever known, but they were carrying the trust of their entire species with them. No one spoke loudly. The silence of the bridge, the hangar, the medbay, and the living quarters was filled with quiet determination. As the ship broke free of Earth's orbit, the crew could still see their home planet one last time. It was shrinking now, becoming smaller and smaller, until it was no more than a blue sphere against the black canvas of space. Many of them stood there, watching until their eyes blurred with tears. It was the last time they would ever see it with their own eyes. One young officer whispered softly, "Goodbye." No one answered, but many lips moved with the same word. The captain finally gave the order to turn the ship toward deep space. The engines roared louder, and the dreadnought surged forward into the unknown. Behind them, Earth remained safe for now, sheltered under the sacrifice of its bravest. Ahead of them lay the enemy fleet, a storm waiting to swallow them whole. And yet, in that moment of departure, something remarkable stirred inside the crew. Fear was there, yes, but so was pride. They were part of something greater than themselves. They were no longer just soldiers, engineers, or medics. Together, they were the shield of humanity. Their lives had been bound together by fate, and their mission, impossible though it was, gave them purpose. As the stars stretched before them, the dreadnought left its final orbit. The crew had said their silent goodbyes. The departure was done. There was no turning back now. They were heading into darkness, but they would face it together. The dreadnought had been traveling through deep space for days. At first, the journey felt calm, almost too calm. The crew kept busy with routines, checking systems, running drills, repairing and polishing parts of the ship that did not even need fixing. But beneath the surface of their actions, everyone carried the same unspoken question. When would they meet the enemy? The answer came sooner than expected. It started with the sensors. At first, it was just a faint blip, something that could have been dismissed as a stray signal. But then another appeared, and another. The crew gathered around the screens as the blips multiplied until the entire radar was crowded with moving dots. Each dot was an enemy vessel. What they saw made their hearts tighten. The enemy fleet was enormous, hundreds of ships, spread out across the darkness like a swarm of predators. The dreadnought was alone. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence of the bridge felt heavier than the vacuum outside. Every officer knew what the readings meant. The mission they had accepted was now real. This was no training, no theory. The enemy was here, and there would be no escape. The captain broke the silence. His voice was calm, steady, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "All stations," he said, "prepare for battle." The ship came alive instantly. Sirens echoed through the halls. Red lights flashed. Gunners sprinted to their posts, strapping themselves into heavy chairs as weapon systems powered up. Engineers raced down corridors to reinforce shields and redirect energy to the engines. Medics prepared stretchers and supplies, knowing the first casualties would not be far away. The entire dreadnought became a machine of war, each person a vital part of its beating heart. Outside, the enemy fleet grew larger on the main screen. The ships were massive, jagged in design, and moved with terrifying coordination. Their weapons glowed with cold light, promising destruction. Even the most seasoned officers felt a chill as they watched the armada advance. Still, the humans did not hesitate. Targeting systems online, one officer reported. Shields at full strength, another confirmed. The captain studied the incoming swarm. He knew there was no chance of winning, not in the traditional sense. But winning was not their mission. Their mission was to hold, to fight, to make the enemy bleed for every inch of space. His orders were simple. "Engage at full strength," he commanded. The first shots were fired. Lances of energy streaked across the void, striking against the dreadnought's shields. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring as the first impacts landed. The crew braced themselves, teeth clenched, but they held firm. "Return fire," the captain ordered. The dreadnought's cannons roared, sending volleys of blazing plasma into the enemy ranks. The recoil trembled through the entire ship, a thunder that echoed in the bones of every crew member. One enemy frigate exploded in a burst of flame, pieces of metal scattering into the void. The crew cheered, but the celebration was short. For every ship they destroyed, dozens more surged forward. The enemy responded with fury. Wave after wave of firepower hammered against the dreadnought's shields. Sparks flew across control panels. Metal groaned under the pressure. Officers shouted coordinates, adjusting the ship's angle to absorb the impacts. The dreadnought was built to withstand punishment, but even its mighty frame could not endure forever. In the hangar, damaged crews rushed to patch breaches as they formed. Fires erupted in lower decks, quickly smothered by emergency systems, but not before filling the air with smoke and heat. Medics dragged the injured onto stretchers, their faces pale but determined. No one stopped working, not even when exhaustion threatened to overtake them. Through it all, the dreadnought fought back. Its guns never stopped firing, each blast cutting into the enemy fleet. Enemy ships exploded one after another, painting the darkness with brief, burning stars. The crew felt pride in those moments, pride that their one ship, standing alone, could still make the enemy pay dearly. But the enemy was relentless. Their numbers seemed endless, their attacks never slowing. The dreadnought's shields flickered under the strain, threatening to collapse. Warning lights flashed on every console, but the captain refused to retreat. His voice cut through the chaos with steady commands, guiding his crew like a lighthouse in a storm. On the observation deck, a young officer gripped the railing, staring at the swarm outside. The scale of it was overwhelming, a living sea of fire and steel. Fear tightened her chest, but when she looked around and saw her fellow crew members fighting with unbroken focus, she found her courage. She turned back to her console and worked faster. The dreadnought groaned again as another wave struck. The ship shook so violently that some crew were thrown from their seats, scrambling back to position. But still, they fought. Still, they held the line. Minutes felt like hours. Every second was survival. Every hit they endured, every ship they destroyed, meant one more heartbeat of safety for Earth. And though the enemy outnumbered them beyond reason, the humans refused to give ground. When the first wave of the enemy finally broke and retreated to regroup, the crew of the dreadnought sat in silence. Sweat covered their faces, their hands shook, and the ship around them was scarred and burning. But the dreadnought still stood. It was battered, but it was unbroken. The captain looked at his crew, his voice firm. "They thought we would fall quickly," he said. "Now they know we will not fall at all." The crew straightened, their exhaustion melting into determination. They knew the battle had only begun. The enemy would return, stronger than before. But they also knew something else, something that gave them strength. The first contact had been made, and the humans had not broken. Against impossible odds, one ship had stood against hundreds. And though the fight ahead was certain to bring pain and death, the dreadnought had already proven something powerful. It refused to fall. The silence after the first wave did not last long. The enemy had pulled back only to prepare for another strike, and the humans knew it. On the dreadnought's bridge, the crew worked quickly to reset weapons, reroute power, and brace for the next attack. Sparks still fell from damaged panels, smoke lingered in the air, and medics rushed through the halls carrying the wounded. But no one left their station. Every person understood what was coming. The captain stood tall, his eyes fixed on the main display. Beyond the glass and the screens, the enemy fleet was shifting. They were organizing, gathering their strength. Hundreds of ships formed into attack formations, their lights glowing like angry stars in the blackness. The dreadnought looked tiny compared to that vast wall of steel and fire, but no one on board let fear show. They had made their choice when they left Earth. There would be no retreat. The moment came. Enemy engines flared, and the second wave charged. "Here they come," shouted an officer, his voice sharp over the alarms. The dreadnought opened fire first. Its cannons thundered, releasing blinding plasma rounds that cut into the oncoming fleet. Enemy frigates at the front exploded instantly, torn apart before they could even fire. For a moment, the crew felt the surge of victory. But then the full weight of the alien fleet struck. The ship shuddered violently as blasts slammed into its shields. The lights flickered, alarms wailed, and the floor trembled beneath their feet. Officers clung to their consoles as the massive vessel fought to stay steady. "Shields holding at 70%, shouted a technician. "Reroute more power," the captain ordered. Engines roared as energy was diverted. The shields brightened, resisting the incoming fire. The gunners retaliated, aiming at the largest enemy cruisers. Huge explosions lit up the void as more alien ships fell, but for every one destroyed, more surged forward. The space around the dreadnought became a storm of fire. Deep inside the ship, engineers worked frantically. Panels sparked, pipes burst, and warning lights flashed across every console. The engineers shouted orders to one another, climbing over machinery and sealing ruptures with their bare hands. Their uniforms were blackened with smoke, sweat poured down their faces, but they never stopped. Without their desperate repairs, the dreadnought would have already fallen apart. In the medical bay, chaos ruled. Wounded crew were carried in one after another, some burned, some bleeding, some unconscious. Medics shouted for supplies, hands moving faster than thought, trying to save as many as possible. One nurse pressed down on a wound while another prepared injections, both of them refusing to stop even as their own bodies ached. Outside, the ship kept shaking with every hit, but still they worked, because lives depended on them. On the bridge, the captain's voice cut through the storm. He gave orders calmly, never raising his voice, even when the ship screamed around him. His steadiness became an anchor for the crew. No matter how much fear gnawed at them, they followed his commands without hesitation. The gunners fired again and again, their faces lit by the flashes of the cannons. Each time the dreadnought's weapons roared, another alien vessel was reduced to fire and twisted metal. The crew cheered for half a heartbeat, then steadied themselves for the next target. They knew there would always be another. The enemy closed in tighter, their numbers pressing against the dreadnought like a tide. Enemy fighters swarmed, buzzing across the ship's hull, trying to break through the defenses. Automated turrets whirred to life, shredding the smaller ships with rapid bursts of fire. Still, a few slipped through, slamming into the dreadnought and causing explosions across its armor. "Damage on decks 5 through 7, someone shouted. "Seal the bulkheads," the captain ordered. Heavy doors slammed shut across the damaged sections, sealing off fire and vacuum. Some crew were trapped on the other side, cut off from the rest of the ship. They knew what it meant, but not one of them panicked. They simply returned to their posts, determined to keep fighting as long as they could. The battle raged on without mercy. Minutes stretched into hours, each one filled with fire, smoke, and thunder. The dreadnought fought like a beast cornered, lashing out with every weapon it had. The crew felt exhaustion pulling at their bodies, but adrenaline kept them standing. Every strike, every shot, every desperate repair was powered by the same thought: Earth must be protected. The enemy expected the dreadnought to break quickly, but it didn't. With every passing moment, the humans destroyed more of their ships, carving holes in their formation. Alien commanders grew frustrated, sending more waves, more fire, more destruction. But the dreadnought refused to die. On the bridge, the young officer who had whispered goodbye to Earth now shouted targeting coordinates with fierce determination. Her fear was gone, burned away by the fire of battle. Around her, the crew showed the same transformation. They were no longer just people on a doomed mission. They were warriors, fighting with everything they had, each heartbeat dedicated to the survival of humanity. The ship trembled again as another blast hit, throwing sparks across the bridge. But still the captain stood tall, his voice steady. "Keep firing," he said. And they did. Outside, space was littered with burning wrecks, alien ships shattered by the dreadnought's fury. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, the humans proved something the enemy had not expected. One ship, even against hundreds, could fight like an army. The battle had truly begun, and the dreadnought was not falling. Not yet. The battle dragged on, and the dreadnought was bleeding. Hull plates were cracked and blackened, Whole sections of the ship were sealed off, and smoke filled many corridors. Every hit from the enemy shook the vessel like a living creature being beaten again and again. Yet still it fought, still it endured. The crew knew that they were not fighting for victory, they were fighting for time. Every minute they held the enemy back was another minute for Earth to prepare, another chance for humanity to survive. On the bridge, officers shouted updates over the constant roar of alarms. Shields were flickering, holding only in bursts. Power systems groaned under the strain of redirection, as the engineers tried to squeeze every ounce of energy from the reactor. The captain listened to each report, his voice steady as he gave orders. He did not allow fear to touch his words. He knew that if he faltered, even for a second, the crew would feel it. His strength became their strength. In the lower decks, the engineers were fighting their own battle. Explosions had torn through machinery, broken pipes spat steam, and fire spread wherever sparks caught. Men and women crawled through narrow maintenance tunnels, dragging cables, hammering metal plates into place, and patching holes with whatever they could find. Their hands were blistered, their uniforms soaked in sweat, but no one stopped. When a system failed, they built a new one. When a shield generator shorted, they rewired it by hand. They knew every second of power they restored meant another volley of firepower from the Dreadnought's guns. The gunners were relentless. They sat strapped into heavy chairs, fingers flying across controls, aiming and firing until their eyes burned from the light of the explosions outside. Enemy ships filled their screens like a swarm of hornets. Every time they locked on, every time they pressed the trigger, another alien vessel vanished in fire. Their arms shook from exhaustion, but their resolve never wavered. They fought as if the cannons were extensions of their own bodies. Meanwhile, the medical bay had become a place of both despair and hope. Injured crew were carried in endlessly, some moaning in pain, others silent and pale. The medics worked without pause, their hands slick with blood and their faces tight with concentration. They patched wounds, treated burns, and performed surgeries on metal tables while the ship trembled beneath them. There was no time to mourn the ones they lost. Each death was met with a quiet bow of the head before they moved to save the next life. Even those too badly wounded to return to duty gripped the hands of the medics and whispered, "Keep fighting. Don't stop." The enemy attacks never slowed. Wave after wave of fire slammed into the Dreadnought. Fighters swarmed across its surface, small but deadly, trying to pierce its armor. Every time one broke through, explosions rattled the decks. Yet the automated turrets and the crew's determination kept pushing them back. The Dreadnought had become like a wounded beast, surrounded and bleeding, but lashing out with every last ounce of fury. The crew's exhaustion grew heavier with every hour. Some had not slept in days. Their eyes were red, their voices hoarse from shouting commands. But none of them abandoned their posts. They fought through the fatigue, through the pain, through the fear, because they knew the truth. If they failed, Earth would burn. That knowledge alone fueled them more than food or rest ever could. One young technician collapsed while repairing a console, his body simply giving out. His partner, trembling and pale, dragged him aside, whispered a promise that he would return, and then took over his work without hesitation. It was the same in every section of the ship. When one fell, another stepped forward. The line never broke. The captain looked at his crew, at the chaos around him, and felt something powerful rising in his chest. He saw not despair, but unbreakable will. These were men and women who had already accepted death before they launched. Now, in the heart of battle, they were proving what that acceptance meant. It meant they would never stop, never surrender, never give the enemy an easy victory. Outside, the evidence of their defiance burned brightly. Dozens of alien ships drifted as wrecks, their twisted metal bodies floating silently through space. Whole formations had been shattered by the Dreadnought's relentless guns. For every hit the humans endured, they gave one back. Sometimes they gave 10 back. The enemy had thought this ship would fall quickly, but instead it was forcing them to pay dearly for every moment. Inside the ship, morale shifted. Exhaustion was still there, but now it was joined by pride. The crew realized that they were doing more than anyone had believed possible. They were holding the line. Against hundreds of ships, against an enemy that had destroyed entire worlds, one human dreadnought was standing firm. The enemy began to hesitate. Their movements slowed, their formations broke. They had expected an easy kill, and instead they were facing resistance that refused to die. They regrouped again and again, but every time they charged, the dreadnought answered with fire and steel. When the sensors showed the enemy pulling back to reform once more, the bridge erupted in tired cheers. The crew slumped in their seats, sweat dripping from their faces, but their eyes shone with determination. They had survived another wave. They had given Earth more time. The captain allowed himself a rare moment of silence. He looked around at the scarred and weary faces of his crew, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the bridge. "You are proving to them what it means to fight humans," he said. "You are proving that even when we are outnumbered, even when we are doomed, we will not bow. We will hold the line until the end." His words sank into every heart, fueling them once more. They knew the enemy would return. They knew the worst was still ahead. But they also knew something even stronger. As long as they drew breath, the dreadnought would keep fighting. The line would not break. Not here. Not today. The dreadnought had already survived longer than anyone thought possible. Its hull was torn and blackened. Sections of the ship were sealed off forever, and many of its crew were either dead or wounded. Yet still, it fought. Still, it held the line. But the enemy was not done. They had learned something frightening during the battle, that one human ship could stand against hundreds. And so, frustrated and angry, the alien commanders decided to change their strategy. They would stop sending small waves. They would unleash their strongest vessels, their heaviest war machines, to crush the dreadnought once and for all. The humans saw it coming. On the main screen, the enemy fleet shifted, and massive shapes moved forward. These were not the fragile frigates or the fast fighters they had fought before. These were the enemy's battleships and cruisers, ships so large that their shadows seemed to swallow the stars behind them. Their weapons glowed with terrifying power, capable of tearing apart entire cities if they reached Earth. The crew felt the chill of fear sweep through the bridge, but no one turned away. They had been expecting this moment. They all knew the enemy would bring everything eventually. The captain's voice cut through the silence. "This is it. They are bringing their strongest. Hold steady. We will answer with everything we have." The dreadnought turned its burning hull to face the oncoming giants. The first barrage struck like a hammer. The ship screamed under the impact, metal twisting and groaning as the shields struggled to hold. Entire decks rattled so violently that crew were thrown from their chairs. Explosions rocked the lower levels, and fires spread through the halls. The enemy cruisers had arrived, and they were determined to finish the fight. But the dreadnought refused to bow. "Fire all main batteries," the captain shouted. The gunners unleashed everything. The massive cannons roared, spitting fire brighter than the sun. Plasma bursts and missile volleys streaked across the void, smashing into the enemy's heavy ships. One alien cruiser erupted into flame, its hull splitting apart as the explosion rippled outward. Another spun out of formation, crippled by the dreadnought's relentless barrage. The crew cheered, but their celebration was cut short as another wave of firepower slammed into them. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring across every deck. Shields dropped to dangerous levels, and systems flickered. Engineers worked desperately, rerouting energy and patching cables with their bare hands. Sweat poured down their faces, sparks burned their skin, but they did not stop. They couldn't stop. In the medbay, chaos had become constant. More and more wounded poured in, their uniforms torn, their bodies broken. Medics moved like shadows in the smoke, working without rest, stitching wounds and stopping bleeding with hands that never stopped trembling. Yet even the wounded begged to be returned to duty, refusing to stay down while the battle raged. The dreadnought's strength was fading, but the captain had one last card to play. Hidden deep within the ship were reserves no one expected, missile silos and experimental plasma cannons that had never been tested in real combat. They were meant to be used only in desperation. And this was desperation. "Arm the silos," the captain ordered. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. The order spread through the ship like fire. Crews rushed to unlock the hidden systems, powering up weapons that glowed with an eerie light. The ship hummed with new energy, dangerous and unstable. Everyone knew this was their final chance to strike back with everything they had. The captain gave the command. Fire! The dreadnought unleashed its hidden fury. Dozens of missiles shot into the darkness, splitting apart to reveal even more warheads inside. Plasma cannons lit up the void, beams of raw energy cutting straight through enemy armor. The results were devastating. One by one, the enemy's heavy ships exploded. Cruisers that had seemed unstoppable burst into fireballs, their debris scattering like shattered stars. Battleships cracked under the relentless blasts, splitting in half as flames consumed them. The enemy fleet staggered under the unexpected assault, their formations breaking apart in chaos. The humans cheered through their exhaustion. For the first time, it felt like the enemy was not only being held back but truly hurt. Pride filled the hearts of the crew. Against impossible odds, they had destroyed ships that should have been untouchable. The dreadnought had shown that it could fight giants and win. But victory came at a cost. The secret weapons drained the ship's last reserves of power. The engines flickered, the shields weakened, and the lights dimmed across the halls. The dreadnought was running on scraps of energy now, barely able to keep itself alive. The captain knew it, and so did the crew. Their hidden strength had bought them a moment, but the price was steep. They could not repeat the attack. The ship was too damaged, too drained. And yet, none of them regretted it. They had struck a blow the enemy would never forget. On the enemy side, panic spread. Their most powerful ships had been reduced to wreckage by a single human vessel. They had underestimated the dreadnought, and now they paid the price. The alien commanders realized this was no ordinary opponent. This was a ship filled with warriors who refused to fall, even when death was certain. Inside the dreadnought, silence fell for a brief moment. The crew looked around at one another, their faces streaked with sweat, dirt, and blood. They were tired beyond measure. Their ship was barely holding together, but in their hearts burned a new kind of fire. They had not only survived, they had struck back. They had proven humanity's strength. The turning point had come. The dreadnought was no longer just a shield for Earth. It was a sword, sharp and defiant, and it had shown the galaxy that humans would fight until the last breath. The enemy would come again. The battle was far from over. But now, for the first time, the crew felt something powerful rising through their exhaustion. Hope. The battle had raged for hours, maybe even days. Time had lost meaning for the crew of the dreadnought. The ship was bleeding fire into the void, pieces of armor floating like broken bones around it. Entire sections had gone dark, and half the ship systems no longer responded. But even in that state, it still moved forward. It still fought. The enemy had been wounded badly, but they were far from finished. More fleets had arrived. Not fragile escorts or careless fighters this time, but hardened warships, rebuilt formations, and commanders who had learned from their mistakes. They knew the human dreadnought was dangerous, and now they came with full intent to bury it under overwhelming force. The crew saw them arrive, hundreds of glowing signatures lighting up the radar. To any other fleet, this sight would have been the end. But the humans did not bow their heads. They tightened their grips on their stations, lifted their chins, and waited for the captain's voice. The captain looked around at the bridge, at the men and women who had followed him into fire and death without hesitation. His uniform was torn, blood stained his sleeve, and fatigue pulled at his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice carried steel. This is where it ends. We've given Earth the time it needed. Now we make sure the galaxy never forgets what humans are. No one needed more orders. They knew what he meant. This was not a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight to make their stand, to carve their story into the stars even if it cost their lives. The enemy moved into range, and the final storm began. The dreadnought fired first. Its remaining cannons roared, missiles screamed into the void, and beams of plasma cut across the darkness. Enemy ships burst into fire, one after another. But the return fire was merciless. Explosions tore through the human ship, shaking it to its very bones. Shields collapsed. The engines burned. Bulkheads split open, sucking crew into the cold emptiness of space. Still, they fought. On the engineering deck, workers with burned hands and bleeding faces hammered on broken consoles, forcing the ship to give just a little more power. In the medbay, doctors who had run out of supplies worked with bare hands to keep men alive for one more minute, so they could return to their posts. In the gunnery stations, soldiers who could barely see through the smoke locked onto targets and fired until their fingers bled. Every man and woman gave everything. As the enemy pressed closer, the dreadnought made its stand in the only way humans knew, by refusing to retreat. The ship, cracked and broken, moved forward instead of back. It charged into the middle of the enemy fleet like a wounded beast refusing to die. The aliens did not expect it. They thought the dreadnought would fall quietly, drifting until it was consumed. But instead, it came at them with all guns blazing, striking at their heart. The crew felt the ship shudder under every impact, but they also saw enemy vessels erupting in flame all around them. The dreadnought was tearing holes through their lines, forcing them to scatter. It was outnumbered, outgunned, and dying, yet somehow it pushed the enemy back with sheer fury. Inside the bridge, smoke filled the air. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Officers clung to their consoles, coughing, eyes red from the heat. Yet no one abandoned their posts. They were locked into the fight, and nothing could tear them away. Another explosion ripped through the hull, throwing people from their seats. For a moment, the bridge went dark. Then emergency lights flickered on, painting everything in blood-red glow. The captain pulled himself up, his face cut and bruised, and gave a single command. Forward. The dreadnought answered. It smashed directly into the enemy's formation, firing at point-blank range. Its cannons glowed white-hot, its missiles shot from tubes already cracked and burning, and its plasma beams cut through the alien armor like a blade through glass. The enemy scrambled to respond, but they could not stop the fury of a ship that refused to die. The price was unbearable. Entire decks were lost, crew screaming as fire consumed them. Explosions rocked every corner of the vessel. But for every loss, the dreadnought took another enemy with it. It dragged the enemy into hell, one ship at a time. Even the aliens, ruthless and cold, began to feel fear. Their senses showed what should have been impossible, that one dying human dreadnought had destroyed more ships than entire fleets had before. It was not just a battle anymore. It was a legend being born in real time. Finally, the dreadnought's hull could take no more. Its engines sputtered, its shields gone, its weapons firing slower and slower. The ship was crumbling, but it still faced the enemy. Still, its guns kept roaring, even when the power meters showed nothing left. The crew refused to stop pulling their triggers. The captain stood at the center of the bridge, gripping the console with both hands. His voice was quiet now, but steady. Let them remember us. The last barrage fired. Missiles streaked into the enemy fleet, detonating in blinding fire. Plasma beams carved across the nearest warship, splitting it in half. The dreadnought gave everything in its final breath, pouring all that remained into one last strike. The blast tore through the enemy line, leaving broken ships and fire in the void. The dreadnought shuddered, its heart finally giving out, and slowly it began to fall silent. The crew felt the rumble beneath their feet fade. Systems flickered and died. But no one looked away from the screen. They watched as enemy ships drifted, broken and burning. They watched as their final strike left the galaxy in awe. The dreadnought was finished, but it had stood until the very end. And in its final stand, it had proven something no one could ever erase. Humanity might fall, but it would never fall quietly. It would fight until the last breath. The silence after the battle was heavy. The dreadnought drifted through space, broken and lifeless, its hull scorched black, its lights gone. No signals came from within. For those who watched from afar, it seemed like the final chapter of a ship that had given everything. The galaxy thought the story would end there, with one human warship destroyed among countless others. But the truth was different. That silence became the beginning of a legend. The enemy fleets, though victorious on paper, carried no pride. Their ships limped back with torn hulls and shattered crews. The cost had been enormous. Hundreds of their vessels lay scattered, burned to ash by one single dreadnought. Commanders argued in private, their voices shaking with disbelief. How had a lone human warship destroyed so much? How had it stood against a force designed to crush entire civilizations? No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the answer was clear. The humans had something no calculation could predict. They had a spirit that refused to surrender, a fire that burned brighter than fear. The surviving alien officers tried to erase the event from records. They ordered reports sealed, casualties hidden, and whispers silenced. But stories cannot be buried so easily. Survivors talked. Low-ranking soldiers shared what they had seen with their families. Traders overheard fragments in docking bays. Soon, the tale began to spread across the stars. People whispered about the dreadnought that fought until its last breath. They spoke of how it faced a fleet that should have crushed it instantly, yet it carved a path through the enemy line. They described how even in its final moments, when broken and burning, it kept firing, refusing to bow. The story grew. Some added details, claims of the ship glowing with fire like a second sun, or of human voices still echoing in the void after the ship was gone. Others swore they saw the dreadnought charge into the enemy with such fury that even hardened alien captains felt terror. Whether true or exaggerated, the tale inspired awe. Among the humans, the loss of the dreadnought was felt deeply. Earth had watched the battle unfold from distant transmissions. Families knew their sons and daughters had gone on a mission they would never return from. But instead of mourning with despair, humanity remembered with pride. The crew had not died in vain. They had written a message in the stars: humans do not surrender. In academies, children learned the story of the one-way mission. Teachers spoke of the men and women who had stepped into certain death without hesitation. Pilots studied the tactics of the last stand, analyzing how the dreadnought turned weakness into power, how it kept fighting even when stripped of everything. To young cadets, it became a symbol, a reminder that courage mattered more than numbers. But it was not only humans who remembered. Other civilizations heard the tale. Some feared it, some respected it, and a few, secretly, admired it. Races that had long considered humans fragile now realized they had underestimated them. They had seen a glimpse of something dangerous, a will that could not be broken, even when cornered. Whispers turned into warnings. When alien commanders planned future battles, the word dreadnought carried a shadow behind it. Ships paused when human vessels appeared on sensors, remembering the legend. Even allies of the enemy began to hesitate, questioning if it was wise to provoke such a species. The wreck of the dreadnought itself became sacred. Though dead, it still drifted among the stars, a grave for the brave. Human scouts later found it, floating in silence. They approached carefully, not with sadness alone, but with honor. They placed markers nearby, so that no one would forget where it fell. They called it the last stand of the dreadnought. When the first human fleet returned to that place years later, they did not dismantle the wreck or strip it for parts. Instead, they left it untouched, a monument in the void. They built a beacon beside it, broadcasting a single message to anyone who passed. Here lies the ship that refused to fall. Remember its crew. Remember humanity. Travelers from every corner of the galaxy passed through that sector. Some stopped in silence. Others offered prayers, even if they were not human. And some turned away quickly, unwilling to face the uncomfortable truth that this broken ship had destroyed so many of their own. Over time, songs were written, paintings made, and books told the story again and again. The dreadnought became more than a ship. it became a symbol. To the humans, it was proof that even in the darkest hour, they could rise. To the galaxy, it was a warning that humans were not to be underestimated. Generations later, children still whispered about it before bed, pretending to be the crew who stood against impossible odds. Pilots still touched the hull of their ships before flight, murmuring a quiet prayer to the memory of the dreadnought. And commanders still reminded their soldiers, "Fight like them, fight until the last breath." The galaxy never forgot. What began as a one-way mission became something greater. The dreadnought's crew had gone into the stars knowing they would not return. Yet by their courage, they achieved immortality. Their names may have faded, but their actions echoed across time. In the end, the dreadnought did not die. It lived forever in memory, in fear, in respect, and in the unshakable pride of its people. It showed the truth the Galactic Council had always feared, that humans, even when cornered, even when broken, even when doomed, would never surrender quietly. They would fight until the end. And that end would never truly be the end.